And actually, in the end, what we achieved here is that we disentangled the original heat map into these sub-components, sub-decision makings. And what LRP further allows is that we have these latent relevance information here for our components. So because we distributed or backpropagated relevance scores. What we achieve here now is we can understand what kind of features the model uses. So the animal parts, we know how relevant they were in the decision making. For example, here 13.2%. And we also gain localizations of where these hidden representations or concepts are located. Actually, if you're interested in computing such an explanation, also feel free to check out our GitHub repository. So the problem that arises if you want to understand now the global model behavior, how the model is doing decisions and its strategies. The problem for large data sets, for example, ImageNet, is that you have millions, like over 1 million samples. And to investigate the concept-based explanations, which are quite complex on all these data points, is just unfeasible. There are just too many explanations. And in the follow-up work, we realized that in this data set, for example, here you can see the space shuttle class, and each point represents one prediction and its explanation. We realized that there are a lot of similar samples, and thus also they have a similar explanation, and we actually don't need to study all these similar explanations. We can simplify this. And here, for example, we have one space shuttle that is classified because it has a pen-like form. There's a fire concept visible and also a dust cloud. And now there are also here located closely similar other samples that look similar and have a similar explanation. So the goal here is now to summarize explanations via so-called prototypes. And here in the first step, we compute and collect these local explanations, and we visualize them in the first step, for example, in some UMAP embedding. And here we can see that distinct clusters form. And for all these clusters that incorporate similar samples, we show or study only prototypical samples, called prototypes. How can we compute this? Here's a short overview. So we start with the samples of a specific class, for example, space shuttle. Then we compute the predictions, and we assign relevance scores that are distributed to the concepts. So in the end, we have a vector, and each entry in the vector corresponds to the relevance of a specific concept. For example, the relevance for fire, or the pen-like form, or the dust cloud. And these concept relevance vectors then can be clustered, for example. We can define similarities based on cosine similarity. And for the method we introduced here, which is called PCX, we usually use Gaussian mixture models. And what we ultimately achieve is this kind of overview over thousands of samples and predictions, and we can quickly understand our model strategies in detail here. For example, we already know this cluster here on top, but for the cluster here in the bottom, for example, we see that now there's again the pen-like form relevant, but also a scaffold concept, because there's also scaffolds correlate with these space shuttles. However, fire and dust cloud are not visible. So this was now an example of a space shuttle. Now I want to show you some other examples from the ImageNet dataset. For example, here for the lacewing fly. You can see here on the right, again, such a UMAP embedding. And we can see via these images, for example, the location of some prototypes. And on the left-hand side, you can see in these columns, again, the prototypes. And here we show 6 prototypical samples for this cluster. They usually correspond to samples that are close to the mean, the center of the cluster. And looking at prototype 6, for example, we can see that this lacewing can also be brown and was photographed on a white background. However, in this UMAP embedding, we also see a clear outlier. Here, this is prototype 1, and prototype 1 shows butterflies and not a lacewing fly. And this is kind of surprising, but actually when you research a bit, it's not that surprising because ImageNet was created by crawling the web for images using some class label, in this case, the lacewing. And interestingly, there's not only the lacewing fly, but there's also a lacewing butterfly. And this was about in 4% of the cases that an image from this butterfly was actually crawled and appeared in the training set. So this is also great for revealing kind of issues with the data set. And here's another example for the railroad passenger car class. And here actually only trains are meant. However, there are also buses and of course also cars, because car is also part of the name. Now, let's remember that for each point here or prototype, we also know which concepts were relevant. And here, for example, I show you the prototypes of the carton class, and on the horizontal axis here, I show, on the left, I show you the top 3 most characteristic concepts. And whereas the first 2 are kind of distributed or used by all of these prototypes, indicated by this red color, which the more red, the more important. The last concept here is only used for the last prototype. And this concept corresponds to cats and is used with a relevance of 5% for this last prototype. And also when we study the samples in this prototype, we see that there are a lot of cats in a carton. And this also reveals that first of all, there is the spurious correlation, and also that the model has picked it up and is using the cat as a feature to detect a carton. Sometimes this kind of process is less obvious, and here concept explanations can also be quite informative. For example, in this case, where we have a red-breasted duck, and if you look at prototype 2 and prototype 3, they appear to be quite similar in what kind of images are shown here in the prototype. However, when we look on the concept level, we see that a specific concept here, 206, is highly relevant only for this prototype 3. And if you look closely, and if you can grasp what is meant here by these feature visualizations, then you can see that here we have very pixelated image parts. And actually, in fact, in this training set of this duck, about 10% of the samples have very bad image resolution. And the model has here learned to detect pixelated images and associates this, in this case, also with the output of the duck. So we've seen that we can gain with these concept-based explanations, and when we cluster them, a very useful overview over the model behavior. But we can also use it during production. For example, when we get a new prediction during deployment, for example, this space shuttle here that's less visible, so smaller, we can compare the concept-based explanation for this one with the prototype, which represents the ordinary behavior. And we learn here, for example, that the pen-like form is less relevant, which also makes sense because it's less visible. However, it relies more on the fire and the dust cloud concept. This difference to the prototype can also be quantified now and used as a measure to automatically detect outliers or use it also for labeling and to assign new predictions to specific prototypes. I really like to use this PCX technique to find spurious behavior, and often it's also very obvious. For example, here in this medical use case where we have a gastrointestinal tract classification, we see three very, very distinct clusters. And we immediately see that this first cluster here on the left, when we look at the most relevant concepts displayed here, that this corresponds to this green box artifact, which the model has learned to use. And the cluster here on the bottom right corresponds to a black medical instrument tube. So we've come a long way now from simple heat maps to these concept-based explanations that we can also cluster to study the global behavior. However, there are still some open problems. Here, I only want to discuss shortly some of them. We still have the possibility to have a cognitive overload, although we are already clustering, because on the concept level, we still can have thousands of neurons, especially for very large architectures. And if all neurons participate or all these concepts participate in the decision making, we also have to study them. And actually, works have shown that at most 32 concepts can be handled by a human. Also, these concepts of the neurons, or neurons can be polysemantic, so they can have multiple roles. And when you look at these feature visualizations, and also these different roles will be visible. And this can be also extremely difficult to understand. Or they can encode for very abstract concepts. For example, the one here shown on the top right, which, if you just look at it, might correspond to shiny gray texture. And another thing that's quite interesting is, can we actually measure this the difficulty of concept interpretability by a human? And can we use this measure then also to kind of optimize interpretability of our components, exactly to make the architectures also more interpretable? There are already some potential solutions or works on it. For example, quite interesting now are sparse autoencoders that introduce a higher basis in the latent space in order to reduce polysemanticity. And here the hope is that these components in the new basis, they become more monosemantic. However, as you can see, we go to a higher basis, so we actually get a lot more neurons, and instead of maybe 500 neurons, we now have 40,000 or something. And we need so also tools to handle these large amounts of concepts. And there is also another branch of interpretability forming called auto-interpretability, where we use other AI models to support us in interpretation. For example, for concept labeling, we can use CLIP or actually also ChatGPT to get labels, textual labels for concepts that make it easier also to handle. What I'm also very interested in is to kind of transform this component space or these concepts, these neurons that are not necessarily structured into some structured space where we can group neurons where they are located closer to one another, where we can also get an overview, a semantic overview with annotations of what the model has learned. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed the techniques I've presented. If you are interested in it, feel free to also check them out or to just reach out to Redouan or me or our supervisors. Whereas I focus now on computer vision, Redouan will also talk about language models now.
Also, I just wonder, there's a concept, and you propagate the relevance vector with respect to the concepts. So I wonder, is that predefined concept or just automatically extracted concept?
Yes, that's a good question. In like this figure I showed you for this clustering approach, I left it open. So usually when I work with neural networks, I use the neuron basis. So I say each neuron has a specific concept. But yeah, you can actually also predefine concepts. For example, find some specific directions. The problem with like concept activation vectors is what they call it, is that it's not really easy or straightforward to assign these relevance scores, because what you actually need to do is to refactorize the activations in the latent space into your new basis. So there are approaches, for example, called the activation factorization approaches. For example, NMF or PCA could be thought of this. And then you have so you need a set of these concept activation vectors, and then assign to each concept activation vector the part of the activations that they make up. And then you can also assign relevances. So it's all very easy when you do it on the neuron level, but when you want to predefine concepts, it becomes a bit more tricky. But if you have questions, you can also feel free to reach out, and we can also discuss it a bit more in detail.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have the second question from the chatting. Next, can you read the question from the chatting window?
Yeah, so the question is, can you introduce the representative methods and metrics for relevance score used to filter out explanations? So the relevance score, exactly. So to get a relevance score for a component in the latent space, you can basically think of it as computing a heat map, where you get a relevance score for a single input feature. So now you don't get an input feature for a pixel, but in the latent space for a component. And here you can actually use just any attribution method out of the box, either perturbation-based, but then you need to perturb the components in latent space, or some method that is based on gradients or modified gradients like LRP, where you just stop at this position in latent space. And this is what I mean with relevance score. And yeah, I hope this answers the question.